So my name is Dr. Talitha Santini. I'm a senior lecturer here at the University of Western Australia, and it is my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's Environment Seminar Series, Robyn Boldy. I have the immense joy of co-supervising Robyn as a co-supervisor. She's based over at the University of Queensland with her principal supervisor, Dr. Laura Sonta, and co-supervisors Mark Annandale at the University of the Sunshine Coast and Peter Erskine also at the University of Queensland. So Robyn's research interests include mine site rehabilitation, mine closure goals, ecosystem services, and promoting and using Indigenous traditional knowledge in planning and decision making. Her research is based in Western Cape York in Queensland and aims to understand the impacts of mining on ecosystem services valued by the local Indigenous community and identify whether rehabilitation can restore or provide new ecosystem services. So it's going to be on that topic that she will be speaking today and sharing some of the major threads of her PhD research about understanding how mining rehabilitation can restore and return ecosystem services, and specifically so within that Western Cape York region. So Robyn, over to you.
Thank you, Talitha, and thanks everyone for joining in on this Zoom webinar. But for today, I'll be including a run through of my thesis as a whole, which has a working title currently of Assessing Ecosystem Services in a Culturally Diverse Mining Landscape. So I'll include some information about ecosystem services just to give a little bit of a context around the topic and run through some of my chapters and papers that I'm working through, present a few results, and really just this talk is about making a case for why we should be assessing ecosystem services in mining environments, particularly from an individual standpoint, and the importance of services for our well-being, drawing on the case study of Western Cape York, talking about the example of benefits that nature gives us, including things such as this photo on the screen right now, which is a type of grass, which is really important for different dye uses in Western Cape York. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands, including the Yagara and Turrbal people of the land in which I'm on today, and pay respects to past, present and emerging traditional owners who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. I'd also like to thank the Wickwire, Whanakwyth, Alnith traditional owners who, without their help, I really wouldn't be here today presenting this work. Okay, so before I start, I'll give a little bit of an introduction and background to myself. I thankfully grew up living all around Australia, pretty much every state and territory that you can think of, including a significant part in Margaret River in Western Australia. Where I got to experience some of the beautiful karri forests down there and arguably what are some of the best sunsets in Australia. Sorry to all of the Queenslanders out there. But these experiences really helped me grow a love for our environment by experiencing it, and also how it made me feel as well. So following high school, finishing high school in Townsville, I went to do a Bachelor of Science in Geography at the University of Queensland, where I then went on to do my honours project working with Talitha, and that was based up at Groote Island, working with the South 32 manganese mine, where Talitha and I worked alongside the Indigenous mine rehabilitation crew to develop a weed management and a weed recording technique using CyberTracker, which is included in this slide as well, just an example of that. And then went on to continue straight through to do my PhD project. So I started in mid-2018, so I'm just kind of around the 2-year mark on this project, where I'm just really continuing my love for people and nature and our environment as well. So I like to use this photo to start a lot of conversations around the topic of ecosystem services or the connections that people have with nature. It's an image of the iconic Australian bushland landscape, and every person will see something different in this image. For myself, having a kind of science background, I see a functioning ecosystem with different processes that have led to tree formation and plant formation, which has led to clean air, and also just a place that might be a nice camping spot, as just over in the background is the ocean. But however, when we start to look within this photo from a perspective of what connections and contributions does this landscape have for human well-being, we start to open up a plethora of different benefits, both tangible and intangible, only some of which I've included on the screen right now. And this was kind of the basis for my thesis, to start to understand how people use ecosystems and what they mean for people, and then how we can start to manage this. So I've included a broad definition of ecosystem services up on the screen here, which are the ways in which ecosystems contribute to well-being. They're generally broken up into 4 different categories as accepted classification of services, of which are both tangible and intangible. So these examples include provisioning services, which describe the kind of material outputs from nature, such as food or timber, or even getting kind of imaginative and using clothes pegs out of Grevillea seed pods, which is in that photo. Cultural services, which include those intangible outputs, such as the benefits that we might get from camping or recreational activities outdoors. Supporting services are those that contribute to habitat for species, or species habitat for genetic modification and genetic diversity. And regulating services are those that ecosystems provide by acting as regulators for our environment, such as the regulation of clean air and water. When we start to look at the state of ecosystem services, much like biodiversity, we're seeing a global decline, with over 60% of services currently being degraded or used unsustainably. And while the supply of ecosystem services is decreasing, that demand for services is also increasing, which creates a few problems for our environment. These trends are predominantly due to land use change, which creates significant global threats to services and human well-being. And as a result, global efforts to conserve and manage these are in place, such as the HE biodiversity targets to safeguard biodiversity. Ecosystem services also form the basis of different global networks. And there are many global initiatives that include values of ecosystem services alongside biodiversity, which can be used in decision making. So we know in general that land use change leads to ecosystem services loss or potential loss. And from that problem, we started to focus on one specific land use, which was mining, which is a sector that is growing on a global level. We have a general understanding of potential impacts to biodiversity as a result of mining, yet what are the impacts to ecosystem services? So ecosystem services are increasingly used as a term in global industry performance standards, such as the ICMM mining principles, and usually is associated with that kind of goal of no net loss of both biodiversity and ecosystem services. But before we can understand and see if we can achieve this no net loss, we really need to understand the potential impacts that mining might have on ecosystem services. And this kind of formed the basis of my thesis, which is currently a 3-part thesis with more to come. And that's looking at this problem firstly on a little bit more of a broader scale, and then using different case studies to illustrate and show these research gaps in literature. So firstly, to explore this topic and the interactions between mining and ecosystem services, we performed a systematic literature review And so the next few slides, I'll go over that pretty quickly. It's still in review, and a lot of this work I'm currently working on right now, but I'm always happy to later down the track have a chat about some of these graphs and images a little bit more in detail. So to approach the question of how mining impacts ecosystem services, we used this framework here to identify how mining might impact each of the components of ecosystem services, which are these ones in green on the screen right now. So for the benefits of a service, so we can use actual food for an example, which might have nutritional value. We firstly need a supply of this service for that benefit to be realised. And this supply comes and stems from natural capital or the stock of natural ecosystems. We also need, in conjunction with that, some kind of demand from people for this service to occur. And this stems from different human and social capital, such as their needs and social preferences and institutions in our society. So once we have those two, the supply and the demand, we need something connecting this area of where the biophysical supply might be and where people are and where people desire this benefit and nutrition and food. And this is done through what we call flow, the mechanism that allows for the movement of this service to then be realised, and then we can start to obtain benefits such as the nutrition from a certain food. So this can benefit us physically through the nutrition like I've discussed, or even economically if we have a business where we rely on some kind of production of food and the benefits of this ecosystem service. So we wanted to understand how mining, as an example land use, can impact these points here. So we wanted to understand how it impacted that biophysical supply, the demand, whether that changes with mining activities, and whether different manufactured capital such as roads and fences across the fragmented landscape can impact that flow in between that biophysical side and the demand. And from this review, I'll run through it fairly quickly to get into the interesting case study. We found a few strong findings, including some serious knowledge gaps within the mining and ecosystem services literature. With only 47 papers from the academic literature, not assessing greater literature, that assessed the impact to one or more of those specific ecosystem services components, the supply, demand, and benefit. Additionally, there was a lack of global representation. So currently 15 out of the 47 papers were focused on China, which was really dominating this ecosystem services literature. And the majority of these studies that assessed ecosystem services components looked at coal. So this was also dominating the number of publications that came out of our review. And in general, the number of papers in this field was increasing, which is really positive to see more ecosystem services and mining research, which is kind of consistent with a lot of other ecosystem services literature right now with looking at other impacts of land use. So along with the number of papers and the characteristics on the geographic location of papers, we also looked at the individual relationships between ecosystem services and mining within each paper. So we found a total of 313 relationships. And we also assessed during these relationships at what stage of mining impacts were most observed and assessed. And we found clear distinctions between both active mining and mine closure stages, where we saw a lot of positive impacts through mine closure and negative impacts in active mining. However, one point to note out with this is that most studies didn't look at the before and after on both stages of active mining and mine closure. So it kind of skews the data a little bit. But regulating services were the most assessed, and these included services such as carbon storage and erosion prevention in mining landscapes. Yet services like cultural services and some provisioning services were some of the least assessed in our studies, despite the majority of these mining operations located really close to communities and villages and agricultural lands. And coming back to those ecosystem services components, we also found that the relationships were skewed towards the results, looking at the supply and the benefit. So we saw predominantly studies were looking at the biophysical impact to supply and the economical impact to the benefit. So what do these results from an academic literature review mean for people? One of the problems that we came across with the literature, although it wasn't kind of one of our aims at the start, but nonetheless really important, was a severe lack of research around what this actually meant for people and individuals on ground, particularly Indigenous communities of whom are located in close proximity to mining operations, particularly around Australia, as you can see in this image here on the right, where around 60% of Australian mining projects are found in close proximity to Indigenous communities. In conjunction to this, we know that land use change impact services, the ways in which Indigenous people can benefit from country, and this is embedded in culture and individual sense of identity that has developed over tens of thousands of years. Take, for example, the traditional seasonal calendars on this page right here, which exist purely from a person's connection to nature, with different seasons distinguished by natural cycles, including weather, different plant growth in the season to indicate wet and dry seasons, seeing different types of fruits and berries and animals in the landscape, and their meaning behind them. So there's undeniable links and well-versed links in the literature between connections of Indigenous peoples' well-being and the natural environment. So these points led us to the beginning of, in a sense, an ecosystem services assessment in a mining environment that was also located in close proximity to Indigenous communities. The beginning of all assessments start with the scoping phase, which is where I wanted to start with my research. So prior to understanding the potential impacts, we firstly need to understand what ecosystem services are important in communities, rather than kind of coming in with existing classification systems and schemes of what we as researchers deem need to be assessed. And switch that around and start to develop these methods with communities, which is exactly what we did through our facilitated discussions. So we had a great opportunity to take this problem and understand potential impacts in Australia, in Western Cape York, specifically around Weipa and Napranum and Aurukun. So Western Cape York is a region both rich in natural capital and culture, with bauxite minings that have taken place in the area for the past 60 years or so. It also coincides with a lot of physical and intangible benefits from country that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders have been exposed to for tens of thousands of years. And this includes some of the largest shell middens in the world, scar trees, sacred places, and many cultural artifacts that are regularly found within this landscape. So for this step of an ecosystem services assessment, in that beginning scoping phase, we completed a literature review of the area, but we also made a point to do preliminary trips to Aurukun and Napranum to start developing ways in which we might talk about ecosystem services. And one of the problems we identified in the literature review was that real disconnection between ecosystem services that were being measured and people and how to measure that. So we kind of switched that around to design a contextualized method of identifying services that were most important to community members of Napranum and Aurukun. So our aim here was to develop this method alongside community members, and we had kind of 3 general goals around this. The first was obviously developing the method of how we can actually talk to people about services, and then use this method to then identify what services were most important. And third, to assess what attributes of wellbeing were brought up in these discussions, essentially about what contributed to making these decisions. And these are just some images of some of the awesome conversations that we got to have, and areas where I thankfully got to camp and wake up to like beautiful views like that image in the middle there. So the development of this method looks something like this, where we were using kind of thematic visual representations of the benefits of ecosystem services through producing a physical card, which we could then lay out on the table or on the ground and have a real good yarn and discuss about what was important. They went from cards such as this up here, the Bush Food Plants card, which really didn't appeal to a lot of participants. So we asked what would represent this service more clearly. And this resulted in using bright colours and photos, and in this case, foods that were easily identifiable, that really symbolised that this card meant bush tucker. And we did this, and this prompted different discussions. And we did this for provisioning and cultural services, having to nail down 2 different types of categories due to the length of a PhD project. And we used this most suitable methods for, the most suitable method for this was participants to choose 2 cards from each pile. So 2 cards from the pile starting with bush tucker, and 2 from the cultural card starting with cultural long country. And here's how they kind of related to existing classification schemes. So this is taken from the TEEB classification scheme for ecosystem services, noting how we kind of changed some of the wording to make it specific for the area. And we also encouraged using traditional language in discussions, where we had traditional owners translating information, which made the overall flow of a discussion run really smoothly. And here's how some of the cultural cards related to the TEEB list. We also, when we started using these cards, that we had the classification schemes, but we really found them to be quite vague, which made it difficult to then talk about, well, what was most important to your well-being, as they were just really broad. So we took them and changed them into the benefits from country that linked to at least one of these classifications. So you can kind of see spiritual experience and sense of place could mean 2 completely different things in a discussion. So we just changed that to culture on country, and then the cards before that on the right-hand side were there to prompt discussion about what about culture on country was important. And we also included some questions on each of these cards just to really help and prompt this discussion, as it was really informal, and that worked best for this method. So we ended up with about 32 participants, hoping to get more as well. So a lot of this data is not complete, but it's something that we can just start to talk about. And the results showed that there were clear benefits of services that were most important to people's well-being. So those 2 cards, sorry, I should have said before, we asked participants to choose 2 that were most important to their well-being and their happiness from each pile. And this is what people started to choose. So there was a lot of participants choosing cards such as sharing of knowledge on country and recreation, and relating this back to the environment, as well as wanting to see fresh water and places where we could hunt for food and grab bush tucker in the environment. So we were starting to see some kind of hierarchy with services that were most important. We also started to see there was patterns of the 2 cards that people chose, and they chose them together, and we wanted to understand why as well. So we used qualitative analysis in NVivo to start to look at this, and some of the themes that came up with choosing cards such as both recreation and sharing of knowledge together. Why this was some reasons such as family and intergenerational learning, and wanting to prepare kids for the future were some of the reasons behind choosing both of these cards. So following these informal discussions and facilitated group discussions, we can start to see what services in a landscape are most important. For a mining region, this is important because the landscape is ever changing. For mining, this next section here shows on where we're kind of developing ideas on how to assess ecosystem services in a mining landscape. So this is where I'm working at right now, and it's not complete, but I'll definitely share my ideas, and I'm always welcoming feedback regarding these ideas. Unfortunately, COVID threw some curveballs in collecting data, as it did for a lot of PhD students, but I would still like to share some of the preliminary data and ideas around how we can start to assess this in mining landscapes. So the landscape regularly turns from a self-sustaining native vegetation community, such as this on the screen right now in mining environments, to then being mined and post-mining landscapes starting to look something like this. So in order to understand how to ensure that we have this no net loss in ecosystem services that we desire and that is guided by best practice guidelines, we need to take a step back, and after doing discussions, we need to start to produce different indicators and quantitative assessments of how we might do this in a landscape, looking at the landscapes that are intact pre-mining and contain these values and valuable services that were identified in the community. So one of the methods in which we started to approach this was using something such as a timed meander method, which is essentially a meander through a landscape, through a designated piece of land. We used 100 metre by 100 metre plots, where we walked through with traditional owners, and we zoomed in again at a specific service, and that was culturally significant plants that provided ecosystem services. Again, I'd love to look at all different services, but I had to kind of zone in with my PhD project. And when we started to use a timer at the start of this plot, and we essentially meandered through the landscape looking for culturally significant species that we had identified through a literature review and our discussions. And we had a list of them, and each time we would identify them in the landscape, we would record it. And this is Angus and I walking through some of the regenerated land and the native bushland as well, through rain or sunshine, depending on what the Cape York weather threw at us. And these were just some of the examples of the plants that we were looking at. So such as the sandpaper fig, which has benefits and cultural benefits both through the leaves and also the fruit as well. And then other simple grasses that have cultural stories attached to them, and also physical benefits such as being used for weaving and also storing water in some of the dried grass as well. So for these meanders, we selected a few different sites. We wanted to see a range of different sites across around Weipa and Western Cape York to understand both the pre-mining state and post-mining as well. And these are kind of designated with those stars there, where we went around to different parts of the landscape. And this is just some examples of some of the results. Again, these are preliminary results, but I'm always happy to chat about some more of these results of some of the meanders that we did. And in general, we recorded a similar survey effort and number of culturally significant species throughout all pre-mining sites and natural bushland, where we had a high search time, meaning that we spent a lot of time in there because it was easy to find these species, and we kept on finding them really regularly. And we generally spent less time in some of the rehabilitated plots, despite some of them being 20 plus years old. But this generally reflected the post-mining goal for this particular area, which didn't include some of these culturally significant species as having a target and post-mining goal. But instead a self-sustaining native vegetation community, which is often an accepted post-mining land use. You can see we spent less time in the rehabilitated plot areas as we worked through the landscape really quickly and got to the end of that plot and then stopped the timer because we couldn't find any more of these species that we were looking for. So currently in Western Cape York and really in many locations in Northern Australia, we're seeing a rapid growth in mining operations, particularly in Bauxite and Western Cape York. So this is a new development that's going down in south of Weipa. And all of these new developments are a really great opportunity to start to do some of these ecosystem services assessments by applying current management practices to identify whether or not services might be protected. So under legislation, ecosystem services aren't covered, although some argue that they are under different biodiversity schemes. However, generally the land that's protected in these mining environments is done through buffer zones, which is one of the main management techniques when we're looking at ecologically sensitive areas. And this is also the first step in the mitigation hierarchy to start to avoid some of these areas as well. And we wanted to start to see whether these management practices and principles were doing that for ecosystem services as well, including some of these plants on the right there, alongside the waterways and mangrove areas on the left. So areas usually protected with buffer zones includes your environmentally significant land areas such as your waterways, and also threatened and endangered species, and those listed under the EPBC Act. But one method of how we're proposing to assess services, such as those provided by culturally significant plants, is through spatial mapping. And identification of where services might be located throughout using regional ecosystem mapping here. So this method is what we're really working on now. So it's not finished, but it's starting to illustrate that services are both located in areas that already are protected through buffer zones, such as the Canarium plant in here. And so we're developing these maps to kind of produce heat maps of ecosystem services localities, where we can then start to quantify and identify what benefits, either economic or biophysical nutrition, that we might want to start looking at that these plants entail. So that might include such as timber as well. And we want to start to approach and understand this question of whether or not these services can be returned in post-mining landscapes as well, whether we will see that no net loss, or whether certain areas of the landscape might need to be protected for their ecosystem services value. Currently, there's no kind of real set guidelines and defined guidelines, of how to do an ecosystem services assessment. So now is kind of a great time to start talking about these methods. So you can see in the image before, this particular culturally significant plant, Canarium, was protected, but some other ones, such as the Nonda tree, were located in the landscape where mining was to be located as well. So what's next for this work? So I'm going to be continuing to do these spatial mapping exercises to develop heat maps for our case study area. And following this, along with kind of following the stage of mine, I'd really like to start working on planning for post-mining closure goals alongside community and doing research on how we might achieve this. It's a fantastic chance to establish how nature benefits and contributes to human well-being, and then understand how we can return these values that people hold in post-mining environments. So there's an increasing mention of ecosystem services, assessments, and guidelines for developing criteria, yet overall it's definitely an area where we can build upon and start providing these more case studies and examples of post-mining sites that incorporate ecosystem services into post-mining closure goals and understanding what these might actually start to look like. So for this to be achieved and incorporate these goals, we really need to start developing post-mining land use indicators that actually start to mean something to the social and environmental conditions of an area. So what returning values of country to the land looks like to one person might look completely different to another. Going back to that image at the start of the presentation, looking at a piece of a land, it looks completely different to a lot of people. And if we don't start to address this fact of understanding what, from an individual standpoint, about what ecosystem services can mean for people and contribute to people, and what they value, then hopes of obtaining this no net loss of ecosystem services might not be achieved, both in mining landscapes and in a lot of other development sites as well. The only way we're going to start to do this is by really talking and contextualizing our research and really taking a step back from kind of being the researcher with an ideal understanding of approaching the concept of ecosystem services, but actually engaging and discussing with traditional owners and community members of what about the land matters to people. So indicators will differ according to the environment and cultural conditions and stakeholders. And now is a great time to be developing new ideas and start conversations around what an area of land should provide the end land use. So it could look like something like this here, an image of syntropic farming, having post-mining land use indicators of certain both native and non-native species that contributes to economic growth for an area, agricultural business in amongst a native self-sustaining forest in certain parts of the landscape, which might be located close to townships and communities as well. Or it could look like something like this behind the icons on the screen that seemingly has that post-mining goal of a self-sustaining vegetation community, which otherwise might take decades to return to that pre-mining state of supplying those ecosystem services such as bush foods, certain trees that, such as figs that would have been used for knowledge sharing areas, different varieties of animals that are traditionally hunted. But instead it might be enhanced to meet these indicators and the desires of the community from the get-go and from the planning scoping stage. So taking what is important to the community through our discussions that we did and applying it to enhancing post-mining landscapes can look something like this in this image here. Where certain shelters are added to the landscape, native beehives, which both encourage bringing pollinators back and also benefit the community. Planting bush tucker gardens, agroforestry, and having native forest buffers in the landscape are all just ideas of what we can start to conceptualize and implement in the landscape. So hopefully we can use this knowledge through really discussing with people and having those on-ground discussions, contextualizing our research to provide case studies, will hopefully help to return post-mining landscapes that not only look like this image on the screen, but also meet those requirements and the desires of individuals and community members in terms of ecosystem services that really contribute to well-being and making people happy and feel good. So thank you for listening. I'm more than happy to take feedback for a lot of this work, and thank you so much to all of my supervisors who have helped me along with this thesis and process. It's been really fun so far to visit all of these areas.